Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. It is story time. We are continuing on with the heroic fantasy novel Glimmer, which is the start of my heroic fantasy series, the Glimmer Chronicles, which everybody should read because it's awesome. And I've been sharing it here and on Substack and on the Arcaven Comics site. And so we're continuing. I have to apologize because I meant to get this up on Tuesday, but I got caught up in New Year's Eve and didn't do it. So we're getting a 2-for-1 story Saturday today. Hope you don't mind. But this is going to be Chapter 3 of Glimmer Vale. I wrote it. I didn't read it. This is done by a professional voice actor as opposed to just the mere author. And you're going to like it. So sit back, and here we go, Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. Glimmer Vale. Julian limped back to the ambush site and found Raedric tying up the bandit Julian had kicked at the beginning of the fray. He didn't have a scratch on him, naturally. As Julian approached, Raedric looked up and, upon seeing his condition, winced. "You look like hell." "Feel like it too," Julian said. "Where did you go?" "This guy hightailed it. You looked like you had things under control, so I went after him." "Don't do that again. I really could have used the help." Raedric gave him a long, searching look, then nodded. "Sorry." Hobbling over to his horse, Julian fished through the saddlebags until he found his medical supplies. Consisting of a few rags for bandages and a needle and thread, it wasn't much, but it would be sufficient for this job. "My leg and thumb are going to need stitches before we move out," he said. Raedric did the stitching once he had the prisoner secured. Getting stitched up was never a fun experience, but having to lie there without pants in the chilly air just made it worse. The cold numbed Julian's leg a bit, so the stitching itself wasn't as unpleasant, but taken as a whole, Julian would have preferred to do the deed in warmth. Fortunately, Raedric was a good hand with a needle, so before too long he finished stitching and wrapped both wounds in snug bandages. Julian got dressed again and took a few ginger steps. The stitches seemed to hold well, but he would have to take it easy for a few days. They took a few minutes to search the dead brigands. Julian was not surprised to find they had little money on them. But their armor and weapons were of good quality, and would probably fetch a decent price. So he and Raedric strapped those items down on their horses as well as they could. Their saddlebags were already full, so it was a very awkward packing job, but it would do for a short journey. "What are we going to do with him?" Julian said, nodding toward their prisoner. "I'd say tie him to a tree and leave him for scavengers." The brigand's eyes widened and he shook his head vigorously, but before he could speak, Raedric beat him to it. "No, there's a constable in Lyttelton. He'll see that justice is done properly." Julian frowned. "That's still a long way." "About 4, maybe 5 hours. "We better get moving then if we want to get there before dark." Raedric nodded. While Julian slowly pulled himself onto his saddle, his friend fished a length of rope out of his bag and tied one end into a knot around the brigand's neck. The other end he brought back to Julian. "Do you want the duty?" Julian grinned and accepted the rope. Removing his baldric, he looped the rope around his saddle horn, making several turns to ensure that it was secure. Then he draped the baldric over the saddle horn again and looked back at the brigand. "I hope you are a good runner, friend." It was perhaps heartless, but Julian got a lot of satisfaction from the brigand's terrified expression. They set off at a slow trot, just barely above a jog, but after an hour or so, Julian heard a thud behind them, and the brigand began screaming. Reining into a walk, he turned around to find the fellow dragging on the ground behind his horse. Julian rolled his eyes and pulled his horse to a full stop. "I figured he'd be in better shape," he quipped to Raedric, who shrugged. In a louder voice, Julian called back to the brigand, "On your feet! You're slowing us down!" The brigand slowly pushed himself upright. It took a while, but Julian figured it was probably difficult with his hands tied behind his back. Beyond that, he was a mess. The right side of his face was scraped and bruised. His clothing was torn in several locations. He had a big red welt around his neck where the rope dug in, and he was panting heavily. Served him right. As soon as the brigand was up again, Julian spurred the horse forward, at a walk this time. It was slower, but he had no real desire to torture the brigand to death. Killing a man in a stand-up fight was one thing. Dragging him behind a horse? That crossed the line into senseless cruelty. The road followed the south bank of the river as it made its way east toward the lake. Though the terrain of their right was mostly rolling hills, the road was, for the most part, level and made for an easy passage. So despite only moving at a quick walk, they made good time. As they traversed the valley, Julian was again struck by the picturesque nature of the place. Everywhere he looked was another amazing view. When Raedric told him of his plan to take this route, he had at first scoffed. Lyttelton was a flyspeck of a town in the middle of nowhere. Why would anyone want to visit, let alone live there? Now that he had seen the valley, though, he was beginning to understand how it could be appealing. If only it was warmer. As advertised from their high vantage point on the flank of the mountain, this part of the valley was mostly rolling grasslands, punctuated every so often with the occasional copse, some large enough to almost be rightly called forests themselves. There was no habitation as yet, but plumes of smoke in the distance announced fires from chimneys or forges. After a couple hours, they drew near to the spit of mountains they had seen from above. The road became more wandering, to avoid the worst of the hills, as the mountains drew nearer. Until finally there was nothing for it but to go nearly straight up one side of a hill and down the next. The mountains came almost to the river, the main peaks could not have been more than a mile to the south. But from this vantage point, Julian could see that the peaks, which thrust northward from the main range to the south, bent to the east for a while before turning south again. "The locals call this area the Hook," Raedric said, seeing Julian eyeing the mountains as they rode. "Supposedly, if you look at a quality map of this part of the Vale, the line of peaks forms a hook that bends off to the east and makes its own little concealed valley within a valley." "Impressive," Julian replied. Past the hook, the land slowly flattened again until, by the time they reached the southeast corner of the lake, the hills were mostly gone. There, they began to see the first farmsteads. A single farmhouse here, a small cluster there. At first they were few and far between. But as the afternoon wore on, they became more frequent. All as he would have expected. Then, about an hour and a half before sunset, not far from a ford across the river that flowed down to the lake from the mountains to the east, they encountered a farm that had been burned out. It had happened several days earlier based on the lack of smoldering and the general state of the place, but it was clear that the burning was not an accident. The front door was cloven in two as though by an axe or sword. Peeking inside, the remains of a large table had distinctive cut marks, as did one chair that somehow escaped the fire and stood pristinely in the midst of the destruction. But the confirmation came when they stopped, at Raedric's urging, to investigate the ruins more closely. There, within the husk of the burned house, lay two charred bodies, one larger and one small. The larger body, the mother Julian presumed, was clutching the smaller body as though to shield it from the flames and smoke. He supposed the fact that two people perished didn't rule out an accident, until they then found a man's corpse, beheaded with his hands tied behind his back, in a small ditch not far behind the house. "Hopefully they killed him first," Raedric said, his tone carrying the same revulsion that Julian felt. "Can you imagine if they'd made him listen to his wife and child screaming inside the house before finishing him?" "Who would do this?" Julian asked aloud. He looked back at their prisoner and found him close-mouthed, unwilling to look even in the same general area as the bodies. "Do you know, friend?" Julian asked, tugging at the rope as he did so. The brigand jerked and turned a baleful eye on him. "Not a clue," he replied in an oily tone that just screamed the man was lying. "Oh, you know all right," Julian said. "Friends of yours, weren't they? Did they brag about it?" Anger began to well up within him, and he found his voice rising. "Or did you go along for the ride, to have a little fun? Did you enjoy it, you sick bastard?" He began walking his horse back toward the brigand as he spoke. The brigand's expression grew frightened, then terrified, as Julian approached. "Enough, Julian. He'll get justice from the constable," Raedric growled as he spurred his horse in front of Julian. "Remember?" Julian took a long, deep breath to get himself back under control. After a moment, he nodded to Raedric and turned his horse away. "Then let's get moving. The sooner we dump this fellow off, the better."
Man, Kingswood, that was a great chapter. Can't wait to see what happens next in the book. Well, hey, I can't blame you. It's a great book. It's lots of fun. We're going to be going into chapter 4 on Tuesday coming up and proceeding with a chapter a week until the book is done in about 6 months. And so I guess I'll see you next Tuesday for chapter 4. But Kingswood, wait, Kingswood, you can't leave us like that. What if we can't wait so long? That is a bit of a problem. If only there was a solution.
All right, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, Kingswood, I love that story. How can I buy your books? Great question. Here's the answer. best way to buy my books is to come over to my site, michaelkingswood.com/store. That will bring you to this place, which is my company's store where you can get books, merchandise, all kinds of great stuff that I've set up. And but you're wondering how it works. Well, here, let's check out Glimmer Vale Chronicles, which is my heroic fantasy series that I've talked a lot about. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. It's a super fun series. Everything you would want. You should start with Glimmer Vale, which is the first book. Come over here to Glimmer Vale. It'll load up. Hey, look at that. You get the book description, links to other books in the series, great stuff. And you can pick the format you want. You got ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. Not everything I've written is an audiobook yet, but almost everything's a trade paperback and everything's an ebook. But like, hey, I know what you're thinking. Hey, I'm buying from you. How do I get the ebook? There's a service that I work with called Book Funnel. When you buy from my site, they will send you a link. That link will lead you to a page where they will walk you through how to load your ebook onto the device you're choosing, or you can just download it to computer and do whatever you want with it. So that way it's easy peasy. Maximum profit for me, all kinds of fun for you. But I know a lot of you guys, you like your Kindles, you like your other things, and you want to go straight to the retailer, and that's fine. You can come over here to michaelkingswood.com/books2read, the number 2. And I have this handy dandy universal book link aggregator page set up. You can scroll through, look at all my stories, all my books, and pick which one you want, and then go from there. Here's how it works. Let's do Glimmer Vale again. So Glimmer Vale, first book in the series, you click on it, you get this thing, you get the book description, you get all other books in the series, and you say, get it now. Okay, get it now. Look what happens. Every retailer where you can find it is here. You can pick the one that you like best and say, okay, cool. Well, let's say I wanted to buy it in, I don't know, let's just say Kobo, because why not? Click on it. And then it'll ask you, is this your favorite store? If so, you set it. So every time you come back, you don't have to choose. It'll just go take you to your favorite store. But let's just, you don't have to do that. Well, we're going on to Kobo. Hoo-yah. Hey, look at this. Here it is on the Kobo site. People like it. People have bought it. Good stuff. Links to other things of mine. And, or you can do one of the other stores that you like. Either way, you get the book you like. I get money. It's all good. Either way you choose to do it is awesome. I thank you in advance for your readership, and I hope you enjoy it.